So, in the previous lecture, we left off talking about the beginning of the Twin Territories. And so, I want to get into how we specifically get to that point, the actual transition into that point. Um, and so, I want to sort of set that up a little bit more specifically and talk about the birth of Oklahoma Territory in this particular lecture. So, in terms of time period, we left off in 1889. Oklahoma Territory is officially established in May of 1890. So, in this lecture, uh, we are technically going to get into 1890, into the early 1900s, going into the land runs and land lotteries. But I want to go back a little bit and sort of set things up just so you understand um, how things look in Indian Territory just a little bit. Indian Territory as it was as a whole. Um, so, in terms of Indian Territory before the railroads show up, when there was a white population here, before there was a white population explosion in Indian Territory, popular to the prior to the railroads, most Native peoples were actually far away from white populations. There is economic isolation because, you know, both populations, they grew their own food, they built their own homes, they spun their own cloth, sewed their own clothes. Trade was really difficult because they were separated by dangerous rivers. There are very few roads. In terms of economy, you provide what was necessary to support life. You didn't necessarily, you know, produce enough to sell. You produced enough to survive. Land was for Native peoples communally owned. That's the kicker. Um, but then the discovery, as we talked about in the last lecture, the discovery of natural resources is what's going to change the game. The natural resources in Indian Territory is what's going to shift everything for Indian Territory. And now there is no escaping this interaction between uh, the white population and native population. There is no, I mean, you can't um, get away from. You can't turn around without seeing a white person if you're a native person, and that's brand new, right? When we talk about these natural resources, coal, first of all, brings in more railroads, as you know, but then of course there's petroleum. Um, Petroleum was, quote unquote, discovered when native peoples found it in their wells and in their drinking water. Um, and the thing is that native peoples and the white populations used petroleum to treat rheumatism and treat, other diseases. Um, and then, of course, they started using petroleum for more profitable purposes. And then you have the discovery of what's known as Glen Pool. Glen Pool was named for Ida Glen, whose farm had a large pool of oil underneath it. Um, and the thing is that Glen Pool was discovered by a guy named Robert Galbraith, Galbreath, Galbraith or Galbraith. I've never learned how to properly pronounce that. Um, Galbraith arrived in Creek Nation and went to Glenn's farm and struck oil, and entire cities would be established as a result of this one pool of petroleum. So when we talk about how profitable these resources are, it's not just coal, not just lead, it's all of these things. Um, Before I get into the intruders, let me just add this. Um, with railroads, once coal is discovered here and railroads come in, with the railroads, these products of oil and coal and zinc and lead, the products are shipped across the country and then sent around the world, right? And so mostly mixed blood tribal citizens used their huge tracts of land to sell products outside of the territory. And so you have suddenly all of these people become incredibly wealthy nearly overnight. And you have this huge influx of wealth coming into the territory. But again, it's not coming into full blooded tribal citizens, it's coming into mostly mixed blood citizens, if not white citizens, right? So white Americans or mixed blood tribal citizens, and then you have this group known as the intruders. So let me explain who the intruders are. So by the 1890s, most of the free land in the American West was gone, and after you know this decade long depression. And again, in your American history textbook, you can learn more about it. But starting in about 1892 or 1893, there's this economic panic that begins, ironically, because of railroads. Um, there's this there's a massive economic depression. Many farmers leave Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas, and they start showing up in Indian Territory and think that Indian Territory is the place to be because they think that there's work here that's available. And, you know, when they show up here, native peoples who've been living in Indian Territory at this point, for 60 years, refer to these people as intruders. These were outsiders who were coming in and taking over the area, and that makes sense, right? Because these were people who were coming in looking for work, and didn't belong there because this was supposed to be Indian territory. Andrew Jackson said so, right? Um, and then when you consider that you know, these were tribal laws and lands, that they were looking for all of these jobs and the jobs weren't there necessarily. Um, the interesting thing is there was no land available for them because the lands were owned communally, right? That's tribal law. Tribal law says you don't own land individually, you own them communally. What these intruders would do is intruders would find tribal citizens who would then set up this intruder on a piece of unused land and say, okay, well, you can share this land with me, because we live on it communally, so you can share this with me. The intruder would then clear the trees, clear the land of the trees, and then erect fences and suddenly claim that they own that land, put up buildings. They would farm the land for 5 to 10 years. They would not pay rent because they would say, "Well, I don't own the land, so I don't have to pay rent on it." And then at the end, he would say, "Listen, as a part of my agreement, if I don't pay rent, what I'll do is any improvement that I make on this land, I all of the benefits will automatically go to the tribal landlord. I'll just live here for free." And that would be the agreement made. And that's the only way they'd be able to get by. Um, this is because when we talk about what they've left behind in places like Kansas and Missouri and Arkansas, they had nothing. The economic depression left them with literally nothing. So this was the best agreement they could come up with. The amount of land used for farming had increased dramatically because that's literally all they could do, right? Um Meanwhile, when it comes to African Americans, Black Americans show up in Indian Territory in the thousands, and they come to Indian Territory because they think this could possibly be um, a place of opportunity for them. Um, and here's why. It's because of the establishment of these, a part of it is because of the establishment of these all black towns. Remember, as I told you in the previous lecture, they are not given um, economic opportunities in these boom towns or anything like that with these railroad companies or coal mining companies. However, in the early days of after reconstruction, in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, um when black towns are established and black communities are established, there's actual possibilities for opportunities, right? They're not singled out as much. So there's a possibility for better life. And as you can see in this map on the right, um, there are all of these black towns that are established in Indian Territory. So I want you to ignore please ignore the boundary here in the middle of the map here, because I want you to ignore that for now. That's the boundary between Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory. Instead, I just want you to focus on the towns that are highlighted, because all of those were all black towns. Now, all of them in the square, with the square notification was the squares indicate the towns that still existed in the late 1990s. The triangles were the ones that existed pre-statehood in 1907. That includes, of course, the ones that were the ones that have squares, right? So when you see those, what I want you to remember by these all black towns is the fact that these are towns that are economically and politically independent, and they are thriving. Okay. So they have their own schools, they have their own plumbers, they have their own mechanics, they have their own everything. And they're doing incredibly well because they have no choice. So they rely on each other to um, to make sure that they succeed, right? And they do incredibly well. When we talk about um the success of these all black towns, they're left alone. For the most part, these towns are left alone, and I think that's why you have such a large presence of these all black towns. And what you need to remember is that for a while they do incredibly well. It's not going to last very long because um I want you to write this down now so that you can remember it for what will happen in 1919 or 1920, is that these black towns and their economic independence will be seen as a threat. Their success will be seen as a threat. Their independence will be seen as a threat. It will all be very problematic. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Um, when we talk about um, the the lives of intruders, right? And what it meant to be an intruder here in the territory. I want you to understand that this is not an easy life for them. This is not something um, that is without struggle or without burden for them. First of all, what you have to understand is they have no political rights here. um, they do not live in a state, they live in a territory, right? So when you live in a territory, you have no um, voting rights in federal elections, right? So you can't have a say in who uh, becomes president of the United States, and you have no representation in Congress. So there's no say at the federal level. Furthermore, because this is Indian territory, you have no say in territorial government because there is no territorial government, right? So it's very problematic for them. So there's no tribal political participation because you have no tribal political citizenship, and so forth. In terms of education, remember, there are schools here. There are mission schools here, but those schools are for Native children only. There are no schools for white children. There are no schools for Black children. Now, later on, eventually, there will be subscription schools established. The subscription schools will be financed by families in white and Black communities. Now, some of you might ask, well, with Reconstruction, didn't the Freedmen's Bureau bring in schools for the children of freedmen? Yes, but not in Indian Territory. Why not? Because remember, Indian Territory had its own Reconstruction. That's what you have to remember. Indian Territory had its own Reconstruction. So Reconstruction for the South did not apply to Indian Territory. So that's the problem here. So white families and Black families had to finance their own schools in order for children to get their own education. Government services were not available to these citizens. So tribal governments did not provide many services to tribal citizens. So when it comes to intruders, there weren't any government services available to them. So if you wanted a road, then you and your friends need to come together and pave a road. You wanted a water or sewer line, then you've got to be the one to lay it out. Fire protection came from the citizens. Um, that's all on you, the community. Um, Newcomers paid annual fees for permits to live in tribal nations, right? And the fees were really burdensome. These are the only taxes that were paid. Tribal citizens did not pay taxes. Um, that's the thing. Intruders paid taxes, but those taxes were known as annual fees, and they were overwhelming. This is going to be, um, you know, something that's going to be challenged quite a bit. And the biggest challenge will come from the boomer movement. Um, so you might remember that in the previous lecture, I showed you a map. In the smaller map, I showed you that in the central part of uh, Oklahoma, there was this little section known as the unassigned lands. Um, the unassigned lands were given this nickname of the Promised Land. The Promised Land, or the unassigned lands, was land taken from Native peoples, but not actually used for anything. Um, So these were unassigned lands that the federal government had set aside and just kept. They hadn't been assigned to these lands weren't assigned to anyone. It was just land that the federal government had. Non-Indians, specifically white Americans, demanded that these unused lands be settled by them. These white Americans were known as boomers. Um, don't think of them as the boomers that we refer to now. So this unused land, originally the plan was, this is what the federal government was thinking. The federal government had originally intended for this land to be set aside for freedmen, for freed people from the South. But then the government, being the government, changed its mind and decided, nope, we're just going to hold on to it. And so instead, you've just got all of this land. Um, and the boomer movement, members of this movement, had essentially cited the Homestead Act of 1862 and said, and this should be in your textbook, but um, it says that any American citizen could claim 160 acres as long as you paid a fee of $10. You could live on the land for 5 years and own it outright. Again, look it up in your textbook. It should hopefully be there. The government counteracts that and says the Homestead Act does not apply to the unassigned lands because these are not public lands. They were taken for a specific purpose. We don't know what that purpose is, but there is a purpose. So when we talk about this boomer movement, the boomer movement essentially forms in the 1880s specifically with the purpose of opening this land to white settlement. And you have white settlers, showing up randomly and often without legal rights to this specific land and forcing the military to come in and evict them. Though that is the boomer movement. So the boomer movement is essentially a group of white settlers coming into the unassigned lands and trying to settle those lands, even though they have no legal rights to them, and forcing the military to kick them out. Elias Boudinot, who you should be familiar with, the influential Cherokee leader. He's also, just so you know, the nephew. He is a nephew of Stand Watie. So he was at this point a lobbyist for the railroads. So that's how far gone he is. So he's a lobbyist for the railroads. He actually promoted the development of Indian Territory. And he wanted Indian Territory to be a federal territory. And white Americans really like him because he is very much pro assimilation. And Native peoples are anti Boudinot because he is pro assimilation and anti traditionalist. In 1879, Boudinot will write an article in the Chicago Times that brings national attention to the unassigned lands and calls for white settlement of these unassigned lands. And essentially what he argues is there's all of this land that's just sitting there. Why should they just sit there? They should be settled and developed and used for the betterment of all, for all of our sakes. So this article obviously is like a huge, huge boost of support for the boomer movement, right? Because Boudinot, being a Cherokee Indian, is I mean that's just something that's a tremendous support for, and making this argument, of course, is a tremendous support for the movement. And then, of course, there is Charles Carpenter. Charles Carpenter will make this huge gesture in 1878. He leads an invasion of settlers into South Dakota's Black Hills. Um, so the Black Hills are similar to what's happening with the unassigned lands in Oklahoma. The Black Hills, it's the same sort of thing. The government insists this is not covered by the Homestead Act. He says it's yes, it is same thing. It fails miserably. He decides he's going to do the same thing with the unassigned lands in Oklahoma in 1879. He promised these would-be homesteaders um, from Independence, Kansas, that we're going to go into the unassigned lands of Oklahoma. This is 1879. We're going to go into the unassigned lands in Oklahoma. We're going to take the promised land, and we're going to settle there. And the federal government says, yeah, this promise is not for you. And they are met in this promised land by the cavalry. The federal government warned Carpenter. They warned him and said, if you try to invade this area, you will be arrested and you will be imprisoned. So they warned him. And when he was threatened with imprisonment, Carpenter disappeared. So much for that. The real guy that I want to point out, though, is this guy who's pictured here on the top right, and that is David Payne. David Payne, who is the first cousin of Davy Crockett, as in Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett is of a lot of fame, so look him up in your American history textbook. David Payne was given the nickname the Father of Oklahoma. So that should be a little indicator of how significant he is. After Boudinot published his article, Charles Carpenter is not the only guy who tries to invade the unassigned lands. There are several people, but the army continuously kicks him out. There are several attempts, right? But David Payne will lead several resettlement groups from Wichita, Kansas into Indian Territory. All of these groups will be arrested and kicked out. Payne will be fined $1,000, but he's too poor to pay the $1,000. The thing is, though, his persistence will make him a hero. And he is a hero. He becomes a hero to those white settlers who want land and who want to settle. And what's important here is that he becomes this hero in the sense that he demonstrates that he is going to be committed to this movement come hell or high water, because he represents, he will do whatever it takes to settle this land, right? And he, of course, Native people hate him and they hate what he represents, because they see him as an invader. He dies suddenly in 1884, and of course, it's this huge sad moment for white settlers. William Couch then becomes the leader of the movement. He sort of takes over after Payne, and Couch establishes something known as Camp Stillwater in December of 1884. So he moves into Indian Territory Um, and, he tries to uh, essentially take over the area, but the army comes in and ends up cutting off his supply lines, and he's forced to go back to Kansas. So no matter what, the military push all of these people back. Um, and that's the thing, like, the eventually what ends up happening, what's interesting here is um the Santa Fe Railroad is going to play a significant role here, because even after Paine's death, his followers, his supporters will continue to try to settle and get kicked out, over and over again. But what makes the difference is from 1886 to 1887, the Santa Fe Railroad will build a railway south out of Arkansas City, Kansas. And this railroad is going to run right through unassigned lands. Okay. Because a railroad goes through unassigned lands, the momentum grows for white settlement. And because the railroad is in this area, Kansas representatives get involved, and the land opens up on April 22nd, 1889. And that's where we get this official date for what's famously known as the land run. And for those of you who grew up in Oklahoma, and you learned Oklahoma history maybe in the fourth grade or the third grade, you'll remember the land run, or learning about the land run. We actually, when I grew up here, had to participate in the land run, which was terrible. And I hope you didn't have to participate in it. Um, when we talk about opening the land and making that a part of the process here, opening the land meant giving free homesteads to farmers. But that's not the only thing that happened here. Um, I want to sort of make this, or give you a little bit of context here, so that way I can explain what's going on. So, in 1885, Congress passed what's known as the Indian Appropriations Act. So, the Indian Appropriations Act, in 1885, said that Native Americans could sell unoccupied lands. Okay. Um, in 1889, Congress added an amendment to that, saying that it could remove any lingering claim that the Creeks and Seminoles may have had in the unassigned lands specifically. And then, after adding that amendment, they instructed President Harrison to designate a time for homesteaders to enter Oklahoma District. And this is what establishes Oklahoma Territory. So I'm going to say all of that again, because I want to show you all of this with some markings here. So here is what we have as unassigned lands right through here. So it's right through central Oklahoma, right? This area right in here. That's unassigned lands. So the situation is that years and years before, the Seminoles and the Creeks still could possibly have some claims to that territory. And so, just in case they did, Congress said, listen, we are removing any lingering claim to it. So all of this land now is totally and completely available. And now all we're waiting on is for Benjamin Harrison, the president, right now, to designate a time for this to be available. So, April 22nd, 1889, at noon, that's the date, that's the time that this land, the unassigned lands, would be made available for free homesteads to be made available to anyone and everyone. Now, when we talk about a homestead, let me explain what a homestead means in case you're curious. A homestead, as defined by this act, is going to be the same as the Homestead Act, and that is 160 acres of land. Okay? 160 acres is a homestead. So, homesteads were available to anyone who can claim it. Now, this is going to be similar to the Homestead Act also in that homesteads could be available to anybody. So it's not just to regular people. Homesteads were available to farmers, but they're also available to railroad companies. They are also available to merchants seeking, property where it would be best to set up shop wherever wherever they could best reach customers. It's the same thing as the Homestead Act of 1862. In fact, if you look it up in your textbook, one of the problems with the Homestead Act of 1862 is that the Homestead Act of 1862 gives the best land to railroad companies, grazing companies, ranching companies, because you have all of these companies buying up all of this land, huge amount of land, at thousands of acres at a time. And farmers, individual homesteaders, are left with whatever they can have access to. That's the kicker. Okay. So you can see the photograph of people waiting to run and have access to it, right? So there are land runs, right? Which is perhaps the best known example of how white migrants settled Indian territory. But then there are also land lotteries. Land lotteries were when names were drawn from huge barrels. Winners made choices after their names were drawn from a barrel. So you got to choose what land lot you wanted to occupy based on when your name was drawn or when your number was drawn from the barrel. And here, the thing is that, you hope that you were called early on, obviously. You can see from the map how what lands were opened up and when. And you can see the ways that they were opened up as well. They were opened up as late as 1906, which is the year before statehood. And here's the thing, they're all done as Native peoples are watching, right? And this is the other thing. There's a whole lot of cheating going on, and that's where Sooners come in, right? Sooners are those people who were able to access the land prior to the land run being even starting, right? Prior to the gun going off, these guys come out of nowhere and claim the land. So they cheated their way to the land. That happens a lot. So when we talk about making the land available, it's not just about land loss on the part of Native peoples. It's also about the land loss for white settlement too, because all of these people who thought they would have access to the best land, they still get ripped off because somebody is getting access to the land and it's not them.